Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you all to today's Bible study. Thank you for being here, and want to welcome those who are online. We're glad you're joining us, as well as those who are in the room. So, how did Luke do last week, y'all? What do y'all think? I was able to watch it later. I didn't get to watch it live, but I watched it later, and I thought Luke did a great job. Today we're going to do Genesis 35 and 36, and then the next chapter is the story of Judah and Tamar. At some point, actually a week after that, Luke has already requested that one. He wants to do all the hard passages, so we'll just see how that goes. But I appreciate his take on what most of us would say Dinah. Luke would say Dina. But I thought he did a great job with Genesis 34, one of the puzzling texts in our journey here through the book of Genesis. So today we're going to do 35 and 36, okay? And we're going to look at what I call the end and the beginning. We're going to bring an end to Jacob's sojourn outside of Canaan, at least until much later in his life, and we're going to launch the beginning of his life within Canaan and living in the promised land as God had promised him. So y'all remember where we are in the story. This unfortunate incident has happened with Dinah, and then Simeon and Levi decide that they will be the vengeful brothers, and they take this action on the men of Shechem, and they plunder the people of Shechem. And so now you have Jacob. Some commentators say that he's lost a little standing with his sons because he was not going to respond that way to what happened to his daughter. And so now there's some tension in this family. We'll see that play out here in just a minute in the passage we're going to look at today. Jacob also is wondering what might happen to his clan, if you will, because what if the people of Canaan, the Canaanites, decide to rally together and maybe take vengeance on them because of what they've done to the men of Shechem. So there's a little bit of tension in the air when you get to page 35, but let's look at it today. If you look at verse 1, Genesis 35, the text reads, "Then God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel and settle there and build an altar there to God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau." So, to Bethel is the text. It was time for Jacob to return to Bethel, the house of God. And that, of course, is where God revealed himself to Jacob back in Genesis 28 when Jacob had that dream. Bethel is about 11 miles or so north of Jerusalem. And it's going to become a very prominent town in Israel, in the later history of Israel. You know that what's going to happen eventually to Israel is they're going to divide into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And the tribes to the north will be known as Israel. The tribes to the south will be known as Judah. Bethel will become the most famous border town between those two kingdoms at some point before this story ends. It's already a prominent city by the time we get to this story. Abraham, or Abram as he was back in Genesis 12, he built an altar there in Bethel. Abram went down to Egypt, came back to Bethel, and worshiped God again there. And of course, Jacob, on his journey when he was fleeing Esau, he spent the night there. It got dark, and it was just time for him to stop. And he did, and he had this incredible dream there, this encounter with God that we typically refer to as Jacob's ladder. And there, God spoke directly to Jacob. So we have a message from God to Abraham. We have a message from God to Isaac. And now you come to Genesis 28, and you have a message from God to Jacob. And he tells Jacob that he is going to be this father of these nations. And so Bethel is a special holy place for Jacob. There are some Some commentators, when you read Genesis 28, it depends on how you want to interpret it. Whenever God tells Jacob that he's going to give him this future, Jacob's going to return back to Canaan. Some scholars believe that that meant he would return directly to Bethel. Some think it meant he would return to Canaan. But regardless, he is now on his way to Bethel finally, and it is a very special place to him. Now, when you get to verse 2, some things have got to happen in order for them to prepare themselves to go and experience whatever it is that God has for Jacob's family in Bethel. So you have this little interesting snippet of information. If you look at verse 2, Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves, change your clothes, and then come, let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. And then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. So I've called that section purity and protection. There had to be a process of purification. In Jacob's understanding, they were about to be fully in the presence of God in Bethel. And so, y'all remember when Jacob's family was leaving Laban, and Laban encountered them as he ran after Jacob, and he accused them of stealing household gods. You remember that story? And so evidently that was the truth. And now they have plundered Shechem, and some scholars say they probably brought some of the idols from Shechem even into this household. And so you've got a spiritual journey taking place in the lives of Jacob's clan, if you will. And so Jacob recognizes that those kinds of things can't be tolerated. So he says we need to get rid of all these household gods. And it's interesting how it's recorded in the text. If you'll notice, and he tells them, get ready, even change your clothes. In other words, make a significant change and prepare yourselves, purify yourselves, get ready for our journey. Verse 4 says, they gave him all the foreign gods and the rings in their ears. Most commentators interpret that rings in the idol's ears. Okay, so this is jewelry associated with idol worship. And so the idea is that gold or whatever metal was used could be reused to help continue to make further idols, if you will. So Jacob calls for all of it. It's all going to be buried, and that's what happens. And Jacob even says, everywhere I have been, God's been with me. So it's a pretty powerful testimony about his understanding of what's happened in his life. And not only that, the text says, in order to somehow assuage Jacob's fears about what's going to happen with all these other Canaanite clans, God terrorizes them so that they don't chase after Israel. So the protective hand of God is on these people. All this has to be very encouraging to Jacob. And then we finally make it to Bethel. So in your outline, I put revelation and blessing. It's kind of interesting what happens. They finally come to this town, and it's there they're going to, Jacob's going to build an altar. He's going to worship the Lord. But if you look at verse 8, it says, now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried, kind of a similar word to bury in the idols, under the oak outside of Bethel. Isn't that interesting? We're not told in the book of Genesis when Rebekah died. But we are told when Rebekah's nurse dies. So the inference is Rebekah has already died, Jacob's mother. But certainly, you know, when Rebekah came to be with Isaac, the Bible tells us that she brought a nurse with her. The nurse was not named earlier in Genesis, presumably because Rebekah was young, and you would just assume the nurse was a little older who was there to help take care of Rebekah. And now we have Jacob on his way home, and he has to come to grips not only with his mother's death, evidently that's already happened, but the woman that he probably knew as a baby growing up, which would have been Rebekah's nurse, Deborah. and now she has died. And so I think the reason that we have that in the text is just to chronicle the grief experience that's going to take place in Jacob's life during this season. On the one hand, he comes home and he's reunited with Esau, which was an incredible experience for him. But the reality of life is still in front of him. And so we have this comment about Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, has died. And he evidently takes part in the burial of Deborah. But then you get to verse 9, and we have this kind of summary statement about what happens to Jacob once he actually gets to Bethel. Bethel, again, is holy ground to him. It's a special place. He has met God there before, and he has faced some obstacles now. I think in the back of Jacob's mind, he's still wondering what's going to happen to them, how the Canaanites are going to respond about what they've heard that's happened at Shechem, and how much hold does Jacob have over his own boys right now? He's the patriarch, but he was not in on the plan in Shechem. And so I'm sure there's some questions in his mind about what might these boys do without his permission. And there might even be questions about several of these boys' view of their dad now, since they didn't believe he responded as he should to the rape of their sister. Does that make sense? So there's a little bit of, there's grief here, a little bit of trepidation about the people that are all around them, and there's tension within the family itself. And so you've got kind of some interesting dynamics at play here that seem to be inferred in this text. So Jacob needs some assurance. He needs to know that he's on the right track. He needs to know that he's being obedient to God. So look at verse 9. After he returned from Padan Aram, in other words, once he's finally come home to Canaan, God appeared to him again. And interesting, I think this is the first time it says this, and blessed him. So God is now blessing Jacob. But in my opinion, Jacob is a changed person. He is growing in his faith. He is maturing in his walk with God, and God's hand of blessing is on him. So verse 10, God said to him, your name is Jacob, but you will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. And then God said, I'm God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations, or a host of tribes is maybe a better way to translate that, will come from you. Kings will be among your descendants. The land I gave Abraham and Isaac, I'm giving to you. And I will give this land to your descendants after you. And so God went up from him at the place where he had talked with him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it, and Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel, the house of God. And so in the midst of his grief, in the midst of his uncertainty about what's happening around him, and I think in the midst of some family tension, God meets Jacob and gives him the assurance that he is with him, and he blesses him. And he reminds him of who he is. He's God Almighty. And his power has already been on display. He has closed off any attacks from the enemies around them, and he has taken them safely to Bethel. And he's appeared to him one more time. And so the blessing, this future, the promise of descendants that was given first to Abraham, passed on to Isaac, is continued to be given to Jacob. And so Jacob responds by worshiping God. Once again, I just see the growth in Jacob, and it's an encouraging journey for us to see. And then you come to verse 16 and all the way through the end of this chapter, and I've just referred to it as death and life. Jacob has to confront the reality of what's happening in his family. Verse 16, they moved on from Bethel. While they were some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, don't despair, you have another son. Now remember, Rachel said early in her life, if you don't give me a son, I'm going to die. Do you remember that? She was so desperate to have a baby. And now here she is, and she delivers a son, and she dies. She named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Ben-Jamin, the son of my right hand. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is, Bethlehem. And over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Israel moved on again and pitched his tent toward or beyond the Migdal, the watchtower of the shepherd of the sheep. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine, Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. Now, there's an interesting little tidbit. Jacob had these 12 sons. They're all listed here. Leah and Rachel's kids first. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. Now that's kind of a summary statement. One of those kids was actually born in Canaan, Benjamin. Okay? And then Jacob came home to his father Isaac in Mamre and near Kiriath Arba, that is in Hebron. Abram and Isaac had stayed. Isaac was 180 years old. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people, old and full of years. His sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So you come to this point of the journey, and Jacob's grief about Deborah, some of the uncertainty that he's been experiencing, is now compounded by the death of his beloved Rachel. And we get to the end of the text, and his dad dies. So Isaac has now died. So by the time you get to the end of this chapter, Jacob has lost some significant people in his life. His mother's dead. The nurse that attended to her and probably attended to him is dead. His daddy is dead. And the love of his life is dead. However, she has, in her last act, given him a son. And it'll be the only son born actually in Canaan to Jacob, Benjamin. Now you know that Joseph will be Jacob's favorite. He's Rachel's oldest. But Benjamin is going to be special. Remember, we're going to see that played out in later stories in the book of Genesis. He's going to be looking out for Benjamin all the time because Benjamin will be the last child born to Rachel. A lot of things that are going to be tied to this story later on in the biblical text. We'll talk about Rachel crying out for her children and just a lot of things connected to Bethlehem and this particular region of Israel. So there's a lot buried in the ground here, if you will, that's going to play out further in the life of Israel. But Jacob is at an interesting place in his life. There's some question, I believe, about his role as the patriarch. I think you see that in verse 22. Reuben, now here's the thing, Reuben is the oldest son. In his mind, he has the birthright to be the next patriarch, the one who's going to oversee what happens in the lives of his brothers. And typically speaking, in the ancient world, whenever the king died, the heir, the next king, received all of the servants and all the goods that belonged to the former king. And so that included all the concubines. But you waited until the king died before you took advantage of that. So Reuben, the difference between Reuben and what happens to Reuben and Dinah, Reuben doesn't rape his father's concubine. He just sleeps with her. So there's not a rape here. But what seems to be happening among at least what some scholars say is Reuben is establishing his position among the rest of the brothers to let them know he's next in line. And he's going to take what's coming to him. And he's going to show them, even before his daddy dies, that he's going to go ahead and take one of the concubines for himself. Does that make sense? So now you got Jacob watching his kids engage in some interesting behaviors. And now one of them, it seems to be, is actually taking steps to usurp Jacob's place in the family. That'll be Reuben. Now Jacob is paying attention, okay, as he watches this play out. As a matter of fact, if you'll go over to chapter 49, you get to the end of Jacob's life. Luke pointed out last week what Jacob had to say to Simeon and Levi. You know, Levi is going to become the priestly class for Israel, so he doesn't really receive land as part of his inheritance. And then the little bit of land Simeon's going to get is going to be distributed in Judah's territory, so you won't even know that Simeon even has any land, technically, because his land is consumed by his brother Judah. So you get that comment, but I want you to look at verse 3 of chapter 49. Jacob says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. Jacob has a long memory, and this has to do with the character of Reuben. And so Reuben is not going to be the heir, if you will. He's not going to be the son of promise through whom this promise is going to continue to be shepherded. As a matter of fact, some of that blessing evidently is going to be given to Joseph's two sons. And then the actual blessing for the lineage is going to be given to Judah and not to Reuben. So Jacob's paying attention. He is watching, and Jacob knows that the birthright doesn't always go to the older son. Right? He's living, he's exhibit A. Just because you're their oldest doesn't mean you get it. And so Jacob is going to refer back to this incident at the end of his life. And so Reuben is going to get the judgment, if you will, for taking this step, which Jacob saw as usurping who he was as the father in this family. And it's an interesting story on all the dynamics taking place in this family, okay? And you've got brothers that are half brothers, you know, and there's just a lot at play here. But when you come to the end of this chapter, though, you've kind of ended a certain chapter in Jacob's life. His parents are now both dead. The wife that he loves is dead. But he's no longer on the run. He's no longer fleeing Esau. He's no longer under the authority of his father-in-law. He now is his own man. He is now the patriarch. There is no question. There is no Isaac to call anymore. Jacob is now at the head of the line. And he's in the land that God has sworn to his grandfather and his father and to him. And so now Jacob, even though there's grief in this journey, there's also life in this journey. And I believe Jacob recognizes that, and there's great hope in it, because Jacob realizes that the blessing of the descendants is the blessing of God. And as he says, God's been with me everywhere I've been. Then you come to chapter 36, and it's a really long page in our Bibles. And it is there to just give us kind of the summation of Esau. Esau's descendants will be known as the Edomites, these red people, if you will. That's what the word means. And so chapter 36, the writer tells us this is the account of the family line of Esau. Probably the only thing worth noting for me in Genesis 36 is that one of Esau's wives was named Ada. So I think that's at least worth noticing for y'all. But Esau will have 3 wives. Ada's one of them. And his family is going to grow and extend across the southern part of that part of the world outside the boundaries of Canaan. Now, here's the difference between Esau and Ishmael, because sometimes people get them confused. They look at the story of Isaac and Ishmael, and they see the judgment that fell on Ishmael and these 2 brothers. And then you have the story of Jacob and Esau and the sense of judgment on Esau. But Esau, remember, is a full brother, unlike Ishmael. Remember? Esau is actually Isaac and Rebekah's boy. He's not the son of a handmaid. He is the son of the patriarch and the patriarch's wife. So Esau is full blood, if you will. Now, he's going to corrupt that because he's going to marry from among the Canaanites, right? So he himself is going to bring the pollution of the ethnicity. But he's pure, just as pure as Jacob is. So God is going to give them a place in the life of the future of Israel that's different than Ishmael's family. And the stories of the Moabites and the Ammonites and a lot of these ites that you're going to encounter in Canaan, God's going to have specific instructions about how to deal with them. But the Edomites will always have a tender place in the heart of God. So when you're reading, for example, in the book of the law, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 7, God tells Israel, don't despise the Edomites, they're your brothers. So And God even says, I'll make special allowance for them if one of their descendants wants to be a part of your assembly. The third generation is welcome in. God says, now when it comes to these Canaanites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and these others, you can go 10 generations and they're still not welcome in the assembly of Israel. But the Edomites, that third generation, there's going to be an opportunity for them to engage in this relationship with you. And as I said, he says, don't abhor them. They're your brothers. Well, they are. Now, as you know, that bloodline will be polluted, but it will survive. And we will encounter Esau and Jacob again when Herod and Jesus meet. Because Herod is an Edomite. And so you'll have Esau and Jacob kind of at play again many, many years later as this story unfolds. It's quite fascinating. But when you read through Genesis 36, it's just a lengthy explanation of what happens to Esau's family. And Esau's family is built around these tribes and kingdoms, and there are kings. And the text even lets you know that there were kings in Edom before there were any kings in Israel. These folks decided to be ruled in a certain way before Israel even came to that decision. So it's a fascinating take. But basically when you come to the end of chapter 36, you've brought an era to an end and now a new beginning. The life of Jacob in Canaan, free from Esau, now in some ways free from Isaac, free from Laban, and now Jacob is going to live as the patriarch in this part of the world. So with that said, let me just offer you a couple of notes to consider. First thing I would say about this, that promise that was given to Abraham is still shepherded by Jacob. It is still in force. God has not forgotten these people. And Jacob has received enough communication from God to seal that in his mind. That he plays a role right now that nobody else in Canaan plays. He is no longer dependent on his dad. His brother doesn't play this role. He is the one through whom the promise is going to be shepherded. And so Jacob now occupies a very prominent place in history, and he knows it. And he has a responsibility to live a certain way. And so that's why number 2, I'll just say that sojourn outside is ended. We got a new chapter that begins. Third thing I'd say about the patriarchs, it's true of all of them, it's certainly true of Jacob. They just acknowledged God's presence. With God's presence came great blessing. And the way they would do that is they would worship God. They would set up altars. They would stop and pause and give God praise and glory for what He's done. And Jacob is a great example of that. As a matter of fact, Jacob continues to grow in that regard. And Jacob I believe, is going to live that out in front of his kids to let them see the value of what it means to be in the very presence of God. But then the last point I want to make to y'all today is just about God's plan of redemption. You know, God could have chosen to redeem humanity in any number of ways. But one of the reasons the book of Genesis is so important is because it lets us see God's plan of redemption in action in the lives of real people. When you read Genesis 1 and 2, it's this beautiful, kind of all-encompassing statement about God's creation. That God brought everything into existence. It all exists because of His will and His desire and His incredible creative ability. And so He creates everything that is. And He breathes life into His creation. And He creates human beings after His image. And He gives them the responsibility of co-ruling His creation alongside Him. And it's a beautiful story. If you end Genesis 2, the Bible has this picture of this garden, this place uniquely prepared for human beings so they can flourish. They have responsibilities. They have fellowship with each other. They have fellowship with God. They're in harmony with God's creation, and they're engaged in God's purposes. And the Bible says, Genesis 2, verse 25, and Adam and Eve were both naked and unashamed. What a beautiful statement of innocence. And so Genesis 1 and 2 paint this incredibly beautiful picture. Now, I'm not sure how long it lasted. I like to believe it lasted for a while. I like to believe that Adam and Eve lived that way for a season in the presence of God. But then we come to that page in our Bibles that tells a very sad story in Genesis 3, when human beings fall. And then once that happens, the judgment of God is introduced on earth. And so things like blame and separation and pain and death and sin are all now in effect, and they are all unleashed on planet Earth. As a matter of fact, God even brings the curse to this earth. And so chapter 3 is a sad saga. The question is, how is God going to respond? What is God going to do about the sinfulness of humanity? He judges human beings. He casts them out of that place of innocence, that existence that was designed for them to flourish. They're kind of released into the wild, so to speak, if you will. What is God's answer? Well, when you read the text, you go through Genesis 4 and Genesis 5 and Genesis 6, and you just watch things happen. You watch rebellion compounded, so much so that the Bible says God even regrets the day that He made human beings. Remember that? And He sends His judgment again, and He floods the earth, and humanity is destroyed, and the only family that survives is the family of Noah. And then they are then given the opportunity to flourish and take on this mantle from Adam, if you will. But it is a broken family. It's a family that is sinful and is dealing with the curse and shame and the pain of humanity. And so finally you get to Genesis 11, and you've reached the point where humanity has decided that they just might be greater than the God who created them. And so you have this story of the Tower of Babel, where it's just kind of the shining example of the pride of humanity on full display. So what is God going to do? How is God going to respond to all this? And then you get Genesis 12, and God says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to redeem humanity. As a matter of fact, I'm going to redeem all of my creation, He says. And He says, I'm going to do it on the human stage through human people, human beings. And He chooses Abraham. And now this story unfolds. And as we're watching it, y'all, it's just full of obstacles. Right? I mean, it's just everywhere you turn, you just run into obstacles. You got Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt, and Abraham says, tell them you're my sister, because if you don't, they'll kill me. And you have these interesting encounters. And then you have obstacles that are lived out in the life of every one of these patriarchs. We've just read what's happening with Jacob. His sons kind of go off the deep end and kill an entire village of people. And then one of his sons decides, I'm going to go ahead and show everybody that I'm my father's equal, takes his own concubine for himself. And so we encounter obstacle after obstacle. However, one of the testimonies of Genesis is these obstacles are all overcome through this mysterious partnership between God and human beings. So if I were to ask you what's going on today, I wonder what your answer would be. Here's what I would tell you. The great plan of redemption is in full force today, being lived out on the human stage through the lives of human beings like me and you. And it faces all kinds of obstacles. But it is still in force. And God's plan is still in place. And God is going to redeem everything that's broken about His creation and bring it into full consummation one day. That's the journey we're on. And we're partners with Him in it. So it was in Jacob's hands in those days. It's in our hands today. And I believe that that is good news and sobering news. Because you and I should feel the weight of that responsibility, that the plan of redemption is in play through us. So let's you and I live into it well. How about that? All right, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you that join us online, thank you. We're glad you've joined us today.